Hey guys, so can narcissism ever be good? Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism? And obviously, the topic for today's live stream came from Gabby's mother, Nicole Schmidt. It came from the tweet that she posted just the other day, this tweet, right? She wrote, "Fed up, hashtag narcissist, hashtag the truth will be revealed, hashtag selfish, hashtag we won't stop, hashtag justice for Gabby, hashtag keep going, hashtag cowards." And then she provided this image: narcissists rewrite history to escape accountability. You are not crazy, right? The first hashtag she used after fed up was narcissist, which seems to be, I don't think it's rocket science to say, it seems to be her Gabby's mother directing that to Brian. Do you think that's a reasonable thing to say? I just want to greet you guys in chat. Some of you I saw just a few moments ago. Stephanie, Lindsay, Ali, Terry Dean, Sharon Tuck, good to see you. Stacey P as well. Catherine Hargrave. Am I missing anyone? Sean Burns. Cotton Star, are you still here? Sir Campbell, couple of you saying it's not narcissism, it is someone who's passive aggressive. Jay Silverheads says every relationship that breaks down the male is a psychopath or narcissist, and another one is control freak. That's actually quite a well-made point there. Mel Stiller, I'm not sure if you're here, but hopefully you'll join us at some point. Not there yet also says, couldn't you just use the word insecure? Kat Dodd says, I know that he has said previously that he doesn't think he's a narcissist, but the note seems to suggest he is, in my humble opinion. Okay, so if you haven't voted in the poll, make sure that you do. Let's have a look where we stand right now. 53% say yes. 25%, so a quarter of you say he is, but it's this particular kind of narcissist. And then about a fifth of you, about 1/5 say no. Oh, Mel, I see you are here. So good to see you. So, so what we're going to do is talk about the concept of narcissism, but also take it a little bit further than that. Apply it to Brian and apply it to other cases and see where it gets us, right? So I just want to move on to the next slide, right? Okay, I think I'm a bit too big there. Okay, so narcissism, in my opinion, isn't as relevant to the Gabby Petito case as many, perhaps most, believe. Certainly, according to the poll that we're seeing here, most of you think that he is a narcissist. Now, let me ask you the question again. Can narcissism ever be good? Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism? Let's just start with that. Let's see what you guys say in response to that. Sharon Tuck says, welcome to everyone coming in. So what do you guys think? Can narcissism ever be good? Can it ever be a good thing? Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism, or is it Brian is a narcissist is a bad person, right? What do you guys say to that? We are in some way. S.M. Kowalinsky says yes. Sharon Tuck says yes. Stephanie Coker says yes. If we use it to do good. Terry says depends on who you are and who you surround yourself with. So S.M. Kowalinsky says there is healthy narcissism. Is there anyone who says no? Is there anyone who says narcissism is always bad? Can narcissism ever be good? Is there anyone who says no? So quite a Led Ketch says low self-esteem plays a huge part in narcissism. So no, being a narcissist is not healthy. Okay, so I'm going to address this to Led Ketch. Anne Trower says, I'm not sure. Well, that's a great answer. So I want you guys to think about narcissism in terms of, for example, an Olympic swimmer or an Olympic athlete, an Olympic sprinter, right? That person has got to dream a dream for themselves. They've got a dream of the gold medal. They've got a dream of themselves winning and everyone else losing. They've got a dream of themselves coming first and everyone else coming second. They've got a dream of they've got to every day focus on themselves. They've got to be, in a way, selfish and self-centered. They've got to train, train, train. But you might say, yes, but that's healthy narcissism because they're training towards a goal that most of us agree with, excellence, right? Well, there's your answer. Can narcissism ever be good? Yes, it can. For example, Olympic sport or kind of sport in general. Is there such a thing as healthy narcissism? Or what about if you are preparing to be Miss America, you're preparing for the pageant and you want to win Miss America, you're also going to be focused on your appearance, focused on yourself, focused on improving yourself, focused on your appearance, focused on your carriage and how you walk and all sorts of other things. You're going to be very self-centered, but it's towards a goal that many people agree with, right? Which is it bad to win a beauty pageant? Well, if you're beautiful and you think it might change your life and you might make a difference, you might say it's a good thing, right? So there is healthy narcissism, which means there's also unhealthy narcissism, which is also why I personally don't like the term narcissism, because you need a certain amount to be healthy. If you don't have enough narcissism, you may not take care of yourself in the way that you should, like someone like Vincent van Gogh. So those who've been following that know what I'm talking about. Someone who doesn't really take care of their appearance, doesn't mind never having any money, doesn't mind struggling their entire lives, doesn't mind being troubled. There is a certain amount of narcissism that's necessary, right? And I think often when we say someone's narcissistic, what we actually mean is they are too narcissistic, or they are more narcissistic than what we are, or they think too much about themselves, or they think constantly about themselves. I'm very pleased to see someone saying, thanks a lot, Anne Trower. Thanks for that. I'm very pleased to see someone say, just trying to find where it's written. Hybrid Pisces, good to see you, says narcissism exists on a sliding scale. We all have and need some narcissism. Casey makes a joke, says the only good is a narcissist. Amy Hall says, I'm willing to hear more. I'm just trying to find the one where somebody said it's got to do with self-esteem. Here it is, Ledketch. Ledketch writes, low self-esteem plays a huge part in narcissism, so no, being a narcissist is not healthy. And that I think is a bit of a misunderstanding, and I really want to address that in this particular episode. So Ledketch, I hope what I'm going to say now is going to be meaningful to you and is going to perhaps shift your knowledge base to some extent, right? So to reiterate, narcissism isn't as relevant to the Gabby Petito case as many and perhaps most of you believe. That's not to say it's irrelevant either. There is narcissism in the happily ever after fairy tale, and a lot of us are subscribers to that. A lot of us want to meet someone and live happily ever after. Is that narcissistic or is that normal? is that narcissistic, or is that just kind of common wiring? It seems like very creaturely that every creature wants to have a shared experience and not be unhappy, right? So if you consider Brian and Gabby's case, where you say there is narcissism in the happily ever after fairy tale, and what about where two star-crossed lovers meet up, they join hands, and they drive off into the sunset? And have a look at this image that we've got over here of Brian and Gabby, right? When you see them there, and this is before the Moab incident, she looks happy, he looks happy, and in a sense, they look like they might be a compatible couple. They might be a good couple. Is narcissism a factor there? Well, you might say in hindsight it is, but we're not talking about hindsight. What about there? Is narcissism a factor there? Is narcissism a factor there? Is narcissism a factor there? But I think the most important thing I want to show you is that particular image. All of us want that. All of us want to meet someone and kind of go on to live happily ever after with them. We want our own happily ever after. Is that narcissistic? Yes, it is, but is it unhealthy? And I think the answer to that is it depends, right? It depends. So if we take this a bit further and we say we all want the fairy tale, but that doesn't make us narcissists. Do you agree with that? The question is whether it's a healthy or realistic narcissism, or isn't it? And that's where you look at Brian and you say, the question is it a healthy or realistic narcissism, this fairy tale? But you can ask the same question of Gabby. The question is it a healthy or realistic narcissism? Was Gabby realistic? Well, I would say that she was more realistic than Brian. Was Gabby narcissistic? Probably in quite a healthy way, and probably in a different way to Brian. But bear in mind that there was the whole social media element as well. Is social media a hotbed of narcissism? So that's the part that I think is quite important, and people don't seem to think about that, because there's also narcissism in the social media aspect of the Petito case. Do you ever think about narcissism in the context of social media, where you like certain things that you like, you hear certain things that you want to hear, you ignore things you don't want to hear? Think also about it from the creator's perspective, for example, on YouTube, with the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard case. I'm going to say something that's going to incentivize my channel. Is that narcissistic by any chance? In other words, am I doing that to suit me, or am I doing that because it's true? Or is it both? Is that healthy narcissism or not, right? But just think about the narcissism of social media in terms of Gabby and Brian. Did Gabby have the same social media as Brian? Was the narcissism in the social media, and let's face it, there's narcissism in all social media. It's the question is it healthy and appropriate, or is it excessive, right? And in the age of social media, I doubt whether one can say Gabby's, or for that matter, Brian's social media paints a portrait of someone who's more narcissistic than the norm. I mean, what is the norm? What is normal social media these days? What is a normal amount of time to spend on social media? Do you see what I'm getting at? And that's why I feel narcissism is an inexact science. It's a label that's used very frequently, but do people know what they're saying when they use this label? Having said that, by the way, social media use is a key indicator of narcissism. Did you know that? Social media use is a key indicator of narcissism. And so now we go to a little bit of research that I did in terms of this. It's a paper published in the ERAU, or the Embry-Riddle. It's actually an aeronautical university, and they said, quote, addictive use of social media was positively and significantly correlated with grandiose narcissism. Let me say that again. Addictive use of social media was positively, right? So it's correlated, but also significantly correlated with grandiose narcissism. So let me ask you, do you think Gabby was addicted to social media? It's quite hard to say. Do you think Brian was addicted to social media? And when you think about it, Brian didn't have much of an Instagram presence. I don't know if he had much of a Twitter presence. I think they use Spotify to some extent, but that seemed functional rather than addictive. Of course, we just don't know. We don't know what the full answer is to that. But you certainly don't get that feeling from their Instagram. You don't get the feeling that they were constantly posting, and you just don't get that volume, that sense of volume. And let's face it, there was far more Instagram posts on Gabby's profile than on Brian's, right? And so if you want to talk about narcissism, maybe you need to direct it to Gabby. And I don't think anyone would say there was anything wrong with Gabby's narcissism, except maybe that there was some anxiety there, that she was, things weren't perfect in some way, that she needed Brian for some reason, right? But the point is that this paper found a significant correlation between narcissism and use of social media. Now, not just ordinary narcissism, grandiose narcissism. And a positive and significant correlation was also found between narcissism and self-esteem. Now, not everybody agrees with this. There are some psychologists, I guess, that don't see a correlation. For me, I feel like it's very it's potentially they go hand in hand. But it is also important to distinguish between narcissism and self-esteem. I've always said Brian's problem was his self-esteem. Brian's problem, and you see that in his confession letter. By the way, what he did is also a problem of self-esteem. Someone who is at that point where they take their own lives, their self-esteem isn't enough to hold themselves together. In other words, if you think about taking your own life, right? It's like the murder of the self, the intentional murder of the self. If you think someone is selfish or self-centered, and then you think of someone who wants to kill themselves, the self-esteem isn't enough for them to say, no, I want myself to survive. I'm so self-absorbed, I'm so full of myself that I want to live, right? And all that. Well, Brian doesn't want to live. That seems to me to be the opposite of narcissism. So if we take that a little bit further, I just want to go to this particular image. Gabby only had a single video published on YouTube, right? And that's just in terms of if you're thinking about addictive use of social media, she's just got one video. And that's why I would also say, if they were intending to make a living on social media, if they were intending to become influencers, they should have started that social media journey long before they actually went on it. They should have set up their website long before all of this. The YouTube videos should have been coming thick and fast while they were on this trip. And so you get the sense that they were not very au fait with social media. And let's face it, some of it's not that simple. I mean, it's the first time I'm doing this particular setup, even though I've been on YouTube for a really long time. Some things aren't really that simple. To be honest, I wanted to wait until I had the right equipment, a better camera, green screen, etc. But you end up procrastinating, right? But there's some people who have everything set up. They spend a lot of money on all the equipment when they've barely got any subscribers, right? And that is also got related to self-esteem, and high standards and that kind of thing. But I just want to draw a distinction between Gabby only having a single video published on YouTube, whereas Brian didn't have any. Brian doesn't have any videos. Brian didn't really have his own YouTube channel. He was sort of a sidekick in terms of Gabby's project. Do you agree with that? And so if he was a sidekick, didn't he feel like a sidekick, right? Didn't he feel like a sidekick in Gabby's sort of project? And he didn't want to be posting all the time. He didn't want to be, he wanted kind of to be on a honeymoon, right? He wanted it to be more about him. So when we go through the laundry list of narcissism checks, did you see what I did there? How many of these items describe Brian, right? Let's just have a look at what you guys are saying in chat. So almost 60% of you are now saying that Brian's a narcissist. And if you add the COVID narcissist, it's almost approaching less than a fifth say no. I just want to have a look at some of your comments. Terry says, COVID, vulnerable narcissism deals with the internal thoughts of failure. I believe that's Brian, passive aggressive. Terry Dean says, sorry, SM Kovalinsky says something else. Someone's goat says, this case is fascinating for some reason, got worldwide attention. I think the live manhunt in the park was really engaging. I watched it all day, every day. P. Willie says, Gabby was trying to produce high quality, time-consuming video, photo production. Brian had no patience for her dream, her work ethic, or her approach. Brian wanted to make it all about him, right? And is that a narcissism issue? I think it is. Is it a self-esteem issue? I think it is. But was Brian's narcissism healthy? You might argue that it was. If you're on honeymoon, do you want to spend your honeymoon making videos? And you might say, well, it wasn't their honeymoon, but I think that's the way he saw it, right? That's the way he saw it. Remember, they were going to get married and then the pandemic happened. Anyway, just to continue, do you guys know what the laundry list of narcissism checks are? So number one, the sort of classic one is grandiose sense of self-importance, right? The number one check for narcissism is a grandiose sense of self-importance. Now, when you look at this image of Brian, does he seem grandiose? When you look at these images of Brian, does he seem grandiose? When you look at the letter that he wrote, and you look at what he sort of did, how messy it is, does his letter writing seem grandiose? Is he really thinking through, is he worried about what you're going to think of him in terms of his letter writing? Not talking about the content of the letter, but the actual letter. If you look at Brian over here, for example, does he seem grandiose? Do you think Gabby's grandiose? Do you think she's sort of dressed up, made up? Do you think there's a lot of grandiosity going on? Do you think that's grandiose from either of them? They're not traveling the country in a sort of a Mercedes Benz. They're not drinking champagne on camera. They're quite casual. Thanks a lot, Cotton Star. Do you think that sort of thing, camping with and peeling an apple, is grandiose? Tommy says, I think he was grandiose in his actions and his view of himself. Okay, well, these are his actions, and his view of himself, do you think that's grandiose? When you saw him at during the Moab incident, and you saw how he was dressed there, was that grandiose? When you look at this picture of him, is he looking at the camera, smiling, and kind of like the center of attention, or not? And if you put the two together, if you look at Gabby and Brian, are they together? Are they grandiose? And there's a little aspect to it that is this whole van life journey was quite a grand dream of theirs, but it wasn't really grandiose. It was sort of inspirational, but also kind of accessible in a way. And even so, it was still a little bit out of reach. They couldn't afford it, right? Tina Vogel says, definitely not grandiose, passive-aggressive, manipulative years. Moon Rain says, Gabby was probably always the center of attention. So that's the first thing. The other one is lives in a fantasy world that supports their delusions of grandeur. Now, let's consider that one. Do you think Brian was living in a fantasy world with Gabby? And I think there's something to support that, the fact that they were kind of projecting a fantasy world onto social media, saying, this is us, and look how happy we are. This is us camping. This is our van life adventure. Look how happy we are. And were they really that happy, right? And there was also the fantasy of this is us on our honeymoon, right? This is us, but for who was it a bigger fantasy? Was it a bigger fantasy for Gabby or for Brian? Homonym, someone says, in Moab, the van was a mess, as was Gabby. He, on the other hand, was cool and aloof. He likely had a rage disorder. True North said he had issues undisclosed. Okay. Okay, so the whole thing about a fantasy world, bear in mind that the whole van life thing was sort of a fantasy foisted on social media, saying we are all going, me and Brian are camping and it's all happily ever after. And then one after the other, and then suddenly the Moab incident happened. Did the Moab incident feature in the fantasy world of their social media? Did the Moab incident, was there any reference made to that part of the adventure? I mean, that was part of what they were doing. Did that interrupt the fantasy of this is us having our wonderful adventure? And the answer is no. And didn't narcissism have a bit to do with that? Because we want to pretend that everything's great, that we are this wonderful couple and that everything's working out. Not just from one person, from both sides. So I think there is a bit of a fantasy world element here, but I don't know to what extent it's true, isn't true of all young people at that age, in their 20s. Wasn't there a bit of a fantasy world in your life when you were 22, 23, right? Anyway, so if you remember, the first item in the narcissism check is grandiose sense of self-importance. The next one is lives in a fantasy world, but with this sort of caveat, a fantasy world supporting delusions of grandeur. When you look at that picture of Brian and Gabby in the tent, do you think they've got delusions of grandeur? Do you think it's like they've got to be drinking macchiatos before they bed down for the night, right? So that brings us to the third one. I think they're about 12. They're actually more than 12, but the next one is needs constant praise and admiration, right? What did Cotton Star say? Cotton Star says, okay, interesting. Ledkitch says she was his property. How dare she try to leave him? Yeah, well, that's definitely a factor. But when you look at this, do you see delusions of grandeur? Do you see delusions of grandeur? Now, some of obviously what was going on here was they were going to national parks. They were going into places of tremendous splendor and natural can you say grandeur? Yeah, I suppose. But they themselves weren't sort of imposing themselves over all of that. They were kind of making themselves accessories to that, right? Doing something like not wanting to drink water out of a bottle and walk around bare feet is to me the opposite of trying to be grandiose, right? The next one is a sense of entitlement. A sense of entitlement. Do you think there's a sense of entitlement going on? I think there is a bit of a sense of entitlement in terms of we're engaged and I've got certain expectations. But if you think about the premise of a van life adventure, we're going to go without home comforts. We're going to be dirty. We're going to struggle financially. We're not always going to have 3-course meals. We're sometimes going to sleep in the rain, kind of thing. Right? Is that someone who's entitled? Roses, someone says hello. Yeah, so Eyes Open says, I do think Brian felt at some point that he was entitled to things working out with Gabby, that Gabby is his. I think that is how he felt. And I also think Gabby marrying her or Brian marrying Gabby, you sort of wonder, Brian, how are you going to pull this off if you didn't have a job? Where were you going to stay? Well, maybe Brian's sense of entitlement was, I'll get money from my parents. My parents will sort that part out. Maybe there was some entitlement there. Maybe the fact that his parents wanted him to marry Gabby and were supportive of that, he felt that entitled everything else that was going to flow from that. Anyway, here's the next item on the laundry list. Exploits others without guilt or shame. Did you see that happening with Gabby O'Brien? I mean, this is from the Lifetime movie, a screen grab from that. Could you argue that Gabby was actually exploiting Brian, that she wanted Brian along for the ride so that she could become a social media influencer? That Brian was there just because of what she wanted to do. And you could even say it was both ways, right? But you don't really get a sense of exploitation. I mean, true exploitation would be Brian perhaps cheating on Gabby or Gabby cheating on Brian, or the one just using the other one for money, right? You don't really get that sense. And I also don't think if exploitation was taking place, then if Gabby died, Brian wouldn't have cared. If he was exploiting her, he wouldn't have cared. And I think there was guilt or shame, and even shame, right? There was some guilt and shame. I mean, if you compare Brian Laundrie to Chris Watts, and you compare what Chris Watts did to his family, and Chris Watts seemed to never consider taking his own life, right? That didn't seem to even compute with Chris Watts. He was like, no, I want my happily ever after. Whereas with Brian, you kind of got the feeling once he lost Gabby, he felt like he'd lost his happily ever after. And he felt I think he did feel guilt because it prompted him to write the note that he wrote. He did say he was sorry, and he did I think that the reason he wrote the note the way he did was not only because he was guilty, but because he felt guilty, right? I'm not saying that it's proper feeling guilty, because a proper feeling guilty would have told the truth, which he didn't do. I'm just saying I don't think there was no guilt whatsoever, and narcissists don't really feel guilt, unhealthy narcissists. Then we come to another trait of narcissists, which is frequently demeans which is another word for insulting or undermining, intimidates, bullies, or belittles others. And I think that is something that we know was true at the Moab incident. We know that Gabby complained about Brian, saying that he didn't believe that she could do what she was doing. He kind of derided her little blog. You also get a sense that there was some intimidation there as well, basically locking her out of the van, also bullying her in that sense. And literally the way that Gabby died is intimidation and bullying to a point of death, right? Belittling others. You got the sense during the Moab incident with the fist pumping and the what else was it? The fist pumping and the joking and all that kind of thing. And some of the things that Brian said was that he was belittling Gabby as well, kind of saying that she gets really emotional and he's in control of the whole thing. And then you look 2 weeks later, how emotional he got, and that he lost control of his emotions, which seems that way. This one sort of links up with I thought I'd already covered exploitative relationships. Didn't we touch on exploitation somewhere? Exploits others, yeah. So this one kind of touches on with that, superficial and exploitative relationships. Do you think Brian had a superficial relationship with Gabby? Do you think Brian had a superficial relationship, like what he said on social media? Do you think that was superficial? Do you think Gabby was superficial? I mean, the whole thing that they were doing was quite a intensely felt thing where they were invested in one another, and they also didn't give up when they started arguing. So they would argue, and then they continued on the van life thing. They didn't let certain obstacles stand against them, right? Radchow says their social media image was superficial. That's a really good point. But that's true of everyone's social media. And I would argue that some of their social media wasn't that superficial. I mean, you saw them reading books, for goodness sake. How often do you see people reading books on social media? I suppose it depends on the social media you're following, but certainly with just trying to find that. So it's not really in this particular image, but it's around this site where Brian is reading one of the books that he was reading. And it's not done in a very overt way, but it's kind of the opposite of strutting around in a bikini or flexing your muscles or showing your six-pack. You're showing, well, this is me reading a book on a hammock kind of thing. Zircon says just immature, perhaps. Letcatch says real readers have ebooks. Well said. Well, Letcatch, have you read any of my books? I've written over 100 books. I hope you've read one or two of them. So what I'm trying to get at is their social media was superficial. They certainly didn't own up to everything that was going on, but who does? I thought it was more, it was quite deep given what they were talking about. They were talking about nature, and they're talking about honoring nature in a way, not littering, and having these deep connections with nature. And if you look at the inside of their van and how they were dressed and the water bottle they carried and the whole thing with notebooks and drawings, the tattoos on their fingers, all of that was almost a statement of connection to nature, which is a little bit of a deeper social media show than you often see. It wasn't just narcissism. It wasn't just all of that stuff. That makes sense. So now we go into the next one: lack of empathy. And I think a great example of was there empathy or not was when you go to the Moab incident and you look at what did Gabby say about Brian. In other words, this is Gabby's chance to go after Brian, to get him into trouble, to accuse him. And she doesn't really do that, even though she's emotional and she's upset, right? And I think the reason is Gabby had empathy for Brian. Gabby wanted the journey to continue. Gabby didn't want to blame Brian. Gabby was aware of Brian's self-esteem, didn't want to aggravate the situation. But the same thing also worked to some extent, although I think to a less extent, in reverse. Did Brian have empathy for Gabby? I hate to come to his defense, but he did sort of say that I don't know. All I'm trying to say is it wasn't that he was entirely lacking in empathy. He said, I don't want to press any charges. I think he also said, I don't mind sleeping in the van. She can sleep in the hotel or something like that. I'm just saying he wasn't completely lacking in empathy. But I do get the feeling that Gabby was a lot more empathetic than what he was. The other thing to consider is when you're talking about empathy for the environment, for example, they seem to care about the environment, like in terms of not drinking bottled water and this, that, and the next thing. That's someone who's quite sensitive to the world around them, right? Someone says human emotions, especially empathy, are not mastered by high-functioning individuals until the 30s. Yeah, so that's another point to make, is that I don't know whether empathy is really a big topic with 22 and 23-year-olds. On the other hand, when you look at Brian's confession letter, as messy as it is, as false as it is, he does say sorry. And he also says, please don't give my parents a hard time. There's a little bit of empathy there for his parents. He also, I don't really like to go into this area because I feel like I'm defending him, which I don't want to do, but where he talks about Gabby was so thin, and in a way he acknowledges her and he acknowledges having empathy for her. I don't believe it's real, but him knowing that she was thin and cold, even in the schema of his own thing, I don't think it means that he lacks empathy. At the moment that he did what he did, I think obviously he did lack empathy and something else took over: fury, anger, hurt, programming, low self-esteem. I think the same thing that cost her life cost him his life, which is his low self-esteem. If he had a healthy narcissism, he would have cared about what was best for her. Like where you say, maybe I'm not the best for you, but I wish you well. I hope you have a good life. I wish you all the best, right? How many people are that healthy in their narcissism that they wish the best for someone that's dumping them or leaving them, right? So that then brings us to the next point. We've got another 3 to go after this one. All we're doing is we systematically checking Brian and Gabby to some extent with these typical narcissism traits. The next one is identity disturbance. And I think this one is actually quite appropriate. I think Brian hadn't settled on his identity. I think his identity was disturbed by virtue of Gabby leaving him. He was who he was to a large extent based on being in a relationship with Gabby, right? He was Gabby's fiance. And I think a lot of that was also how he related to his family. Bear in mind, his older sister was married and he'd been living with Gabby on his parents' property. And I think there was just this expectation from his family that they were going to get married and it was a done deal. And they probably would have gotten married if it wasn't for the pandemic. What would have happened after that? Maybe the frustration of the pandemic led to a lot of escalating feelings of uncertainty. Maybe social media didn't help with that. But there's also the, Cassie had kids already, and Gabby was playing kids to, she was like an aunt to Cassie's children. And Brian actually even mentions that in the confession. And we know that she sent postcards to them. Interestingly enough, there are not stamps on a lot of those postcards. So you've kind of got to ask, how did they get there? Well, one answer is that when Brian went home for about 6 days, I think it was it August 16th or 17th to the 23rd, somewhere around there. I think he took some of the postcards that Gabby had written with him and sort of hand delivered them. But it was obviously a big deal, her being an aunt, and him seeing her being an aunt, and the nieces and nephews getting along with her, and it was all setting up the next thing. And then for that not to happen, imagine getting married and you go on a honeymoon, and on your honeymoon you end up getting divorced. I mean, there's some comedy movies about that. But the fact is, if that does happen, you're going to have an identity disturbance. You're going to have an existential crisis. You're going to be wondering, who am I? And the person you're with is going to be wondering, who are you? You're not the person I thought you were, right? An identity disturbance is taking place. And think about that concept within the construct of social media, of having an identity disturbance within social media, where I'm talking about almost like Chris Watts did via being in a marriage with Shanann Watts and having to thrive in public. Was that going to change his identity? I think it did. Maybe not in a good way, right? But in terms of this van life trip, was there an identity disturbance with Gabby and Brian in terms of the social media narrative that was taking place, right? Was Brian losing his identity while Gabby was gaining hers? Was Brian becoming aware that Gabby's identity is expanding and growing, meanwhile his is not? And so was Gabby seeing that as well? And was that creating an identity disturbance? Was she asserting herself and becoming, whereas he was unbecoming and unraveling? Was that creating even worse self-esteem issues for him? And as far as I know, Brian was quite an overweight kid at school. And I don't know whether he was bullied at school, but you can imagine if he was bullied at school, and a lot of overweight kids are, if he's now being bullied on social media, that might feel like regression. It might, and the opposite, I think, was happening with Gabby. If you look at Gabby's social media, you see how she's actually becoming more and more beautiful. Whereas Brian is, although I think he lost weight since high school, he's going bald. So Gabby's becoming more and more beautiful, and Brian's going bald. And so the question becomes, in terms of their identity as a couple, are they a match? She's becoming more beautiful, more probably liked on social media. He's becoming less beautiful. And so what's his role in social media? And I think if they, and I've seen this quite a lot on social media, if they'd really thought about it, the proper way to sort of go about it would probably have been just to have Gabby on social media and have Brian as the cameraman. Right, that would probably have been the right way to go, where they both invest in Gabby's social media. Right, I don't know what you guys think about that, because Brian's social media wasn't working. It was also just making him unhappy. And doing a her photo, his photo thing wouldn't work. But anyway, the bottom line is you did have an identity disturbance with Brian, where the carpet sort of being pulled under him, and whereas with Gabby, she's kind of starting to go on a magic carpet ride. Social media is good for her; it's not good for him. And that also links with the next one. We've got 3 more to go through. Difficulty with attachment and dependency. Do you think Brian had difficulty with attachment and dependency? Sharon says, Nick, there are reports that Brian was 37, not 23. I don't think that's, I think a simple thing like that, they wouldn't really get wrong. But I mean, he does look old for his age. I mean, I'm bald, but I lost my hair at 27, 28. So for him to lose it at 23 is pretty hectic. The other thing is, I can tell you as a guy, losing your hair is, you do go through a bit of a crisis. It's something to adapt to that, that's something that's changed. And you might laugh at that as a woman, but I think it's the same thing as getting gray hair and getting wrinkles. It's like you're no longer young. It's a milestone that you don't really want to get to. And it is related to narcissism, your appearance. And of course, that makes him less narcissistic because he's not so beautiful, he's not so handsome. Compared to her narcissism, she's becoming more beautiful. So is it a question that he's very narcissistic or not narcissistic enough? He doesn't have enough healthy narcissism because his self-esteem is being impinged. Also, think about his narcissism on a scale compared to hers. She's coming into her own as a young person, whereas his life is sort of falling apart and kind of unraveling. And if you think that the whole thing about losing his hair is not a factor, right? Look at in how many pictures you see Brian with a cap on. This is obviously a dramatization, but there he's got a cap on. There he doesn't. There he does. There he does again. He has a cap on quite a lot, and I don't think it's because he's worried about sunburn, right? Donna says, I think maybe she wanted to go home after that traffic stop and was scared. They probably fought over that soon after. I don't think she wanted to go home. I don't know if you remember when the cop said to her, you would need to go to court. You could see the calculus taking place in her mind where she thought, it's like a situation of, we're going to have to stop this whole project and I'm going to have to go to court. And then the guy said, well, don't worry, you can do it by streaming because of COVID. And then she sort of relaxed again. You remember that? I really don't think Gabby wanted to quit the van life thing. In fact, I've got an idea. She wanted to invite Rose along, and Brian really didn't like that idea. Okay, so difficulty with attachment and dependency. Do you think that is a factor with Brian? Well, obviously it was. You see that loudly and clearly in the confession note. You also saw that the dependency side of that during the Moab incident. You saw that they were both anxious and to some extent emotionally dependent on one another. I think Brian was possibly even financially dependent on Gabby or perhaps on Gabby's parents indirectly. And I think Brian was very attached to Gabby in terms of this notion of we're going to get married. He was very attached to that idea, which is why he posted that well-known thing saying, until death us do part. Now, with this particular Instagram post, he said how much she meant to him and until death us do part, right? And then that is ultimately, he kept his word on that. Then the second last one I'm going to highlight here before we go on. Another aspect that is a typical trait of narcissists is chronic feelings of emptiness and boredom, right? Do you think that you get that idea from Brian and or Gabby that either of them were bored? I do get a sense that there may have been loneliness from Brian's side. I think all artists are lonely to an extent. The loneliness feeds the art, but the art also feeds the loneliness to some extent. Those following the Van Gogh letters will know about this. But so I think there is some loneliness. I don't know if there was really that much boredom. I don't really get the sense that there was much boredom going on. I also get a sense that there may have been a little bit of loneliness, not as much as with Brian, but loneliness with Gabby. And that's why she was with Brian. I think there was some source of loneliness somewhere with Gabby, and perhaps that's also why she couldn't leave Brian. Thanks a lot, Mel. Letkich says he would have cheated on her given half the chance. I don't know how you can say that. Someone who commits suicide over someone like that, I don't know how you can actually say that. Anyway, that brings us to the last one, vulnerability to life transitions. There are more, but I'm not going to go through all of them. Do you think that that's obviously a key trait of a narcissist? Do you think that that applies to Brian or Gabby, or Brian and Gabby? Thought Criminal says she felt like his rescuer. There are often girls who rescue guys from whatever it is, themselves, from incel status or whatever it is. KD says, is there any history of him having prior girlfriends? Not as far as I'm aware. And that's also why she's such a hugely significant part of his life, is because she's everything. You know, I mean, in my case, I didn't have girlfriends until quite late. And so my first girlfriend was also a huge deal, right? I think a lot can be said for that's why you should have quite a few girlfriends. You shouldn't have like this long period of whatever it is, saving yourself, because you can potentially fall very, very hard, and it can be unpleasant, and you can have an unhappy ending like this. The same thing applies to Chris Watts. Chris Watts, I don't know if he may have had one girlfriend for a couple of weeks or months before Shanann Watts, and look how that ended. Mercy says, I think he had issues and lost his temper for the last time. I do think it was planned, but he should have faced the music. Susan says she was rescuing him from living with his parents. Stephanie says, first loves, yes, are significant. Okay, so now we kind of move on a little bit. So we go to the classic symptom of narcissism is a grandiose sense of self-importance. And I just want to show you this. Why is it not moving across? Okay, well, shall I just do it like this? The classic symptom of narcissism is a grandiose sense of self-importance, right? I don't get that sense from Brian at all. When we see him during the Moab incident, although he's a dishonest and smug jerk, he's not grandiose. Does he seem grandiose there? Look at how he's dressed, right? Okay, I'm just going to move this back across. So I also don't think he needs, this is going through that sort of checklist. I don't think he needs constant praise and admiration, certainly not online or from strangers. He's not, I'm talking about Brian as a narcissist in the way that Nicole Schmidt described him. He doesn't seem to need constant praise and admiration. He doesn't need it in a general sense from strangers. I'm sure he enjoyed compliments and support from Gabby. I'm sure he needed that sort of thing from Gabby, you know, like reassurance that I don't mind that you're bald, or you my beautiful bald Brian, or whatever it is. But that's not the same as generally needing praise and admiration all the time, right? Of the 12 checkpoints on the Laundrie list, I think Brian explicitly meets 4 of these, which is to say a third, right? So you could maybe make an argument for a 5th one, but that's still that's less than half. And so, and that is the laundry list of traits in terms of narcissism. And if you're not sure what I'm saying, maybe listen to the video again and write down the ones that I've noted and ask yourself, is that true for you? Does it resonate with you, right? Those items. I'll quickly go through them again. Grandiose sense of self-importance. Lives in a fantasy world that supports their delusions of grandeur. So I think he does live in a fantasy world, but is it a delusion of grandeur? I mean, Brian's delusion was just that he wanted to marry Gabby. Is that a delusion of grandeur? To some extent it is, and I do count that as a trait that matches narcissism. But I don't think he needs constant praise and admiration. Sense of entitlement, no. Exploits others without guilt or shame, no. Frequently demeans, probably. Certainly enough for what happened to happen. Intimidates, bullies, or belittles. All of that ran up to the Moab incident. Superficial and exploitative relationships. Well, I mean, that was, I think, the opposite of Brian's relationship with Gabby, right? It was because it wasn't superficial that he was so upset. Lack of empathy, I don't think that applies either. Bear in mind, Gabby didn't leave Brian after the Moab incident, so she was quite connected as well. Identity disturbance, that's arguably one that could apply. Difficulty with attachment and dependency, I think that does apply. Chronic feelings of emptiness and boredom. Well, Brian had that after Gabby died, right? Vulnerability to life transitions, I think that one applies. So for me, the narcissism label isn't completely off, right? I'm not saying it's, I'm not basically saying no to narcissism. I'm saying it's just not a perfect fit. It's not even a half perfect fit. I just want to look at your votes here, see where we are with that. So was Brian a narcissist? 52% say yes. Only 16% say no, and then 33, that's a third of you. So half of you say yes, a third of you say he's a covert narcissist. And if you add those two together, it's about 85% of you say that. And I'm going to say I disagree. So if I was a narcissist, I'm not really sure if that's the test of it, but I think if I was a lot more of a narcissist, I would just agree with you guys and be popular or something like that. But I personally don't believe in labels, and I think narcissism is overused. And so I don't think I'm with the 16% who say no, that Brian wasn't a narcissist. But I'm not saying he wasn't a narcissist at all, just that the label doesn't quite fit. And now I'm going to explain why. I'm not saying the label it isn't completely off. And that's why I've said there are a couple of traits that he does seem to have. I'm just saying he doesn't fit, for example, the primary trait, a grandiose sense of self. He doesn't fit that, right? He's not wearing a wig or I don't know. It just doesn't sit properly on this case, I think. I find narcissism is overused in general, and it's always used in a disparaging manner to someone you don't like. Another thing I want to bring up is, remember I asked you, can narcissism ever be good? And then I said, is there such a thing as healthy narcissism? Then I mentioned an Olympic swimmer and an athlete and them going for a goal, thinking always of themselves. That's quite grandiose. I want to be a gold medal winner. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Especially if it's realistic. There's nothing wrong with it. There's something wrong with it where you don't have a hope of winning the gold medal, but you act as though you do, right? If you think about a Miss America contestant and she's being asked questions and she wants to become Miss America, and she believes that she's beautiful, and it's healthy narcissism, but again, you've got to say, well, is it realistic? And then think about her gaslighting the audience. She's asked questions, what do you care about, world peace or whatever, right? There's a certain amount of gaslighting in pageantry, but it's kind of acceptable, right? Now compare that gaslighting, which is like narcissism, but it's acceptable in a pageant situation, to gaslighting of a criminal in a police cubicle, right? And then you say he's gaslighting because he's trying to save his skin, and so he's a narcissist. But isn't anybody trying to save their skin? And so it's just a matter of context, whether it's good or bad, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, whether it's you or somebody else. So in the recent trial of Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, Amber's the narcissist, but not Johnny, because if you don't like someone, they're a narcissist. And although I'm allergic to talking about narcissism, there definitely are cases where it's applicable. And celebrity cases are a good example of that. O.J. Simpson, Oscar Pistorius, Amber Heard, and Johnny Depp. Those are cases where it definitely is a factor. But there are cases where it's not a factor. If you think about the excesses in the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard case compared to the opposite in Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, I'm talking about they go on this van life adventure. They don't have a lot of money. They live in a van. They live in tents. They go to a restaurant, the Merry Piglets. I think they bicker about the bill. They seem to be running out of money. They're struggling to keep it together in terms of their social media, whatever. And then compare that to Johnny Depp and Amber Heard that are holidaying on a paradise island. They go to Australia. They're in this hotel. They're on that. They go on a luxury train on their honeymoon. It's totally a different order of magnitude. The one have a lot of excess, and the other one is like deprivation. Some people would say you need to pay me to be in that situation. So I think narcissism is a factor, but it's not brought up in an authentic way by most of the people talking about it. Most of us actually like narcissists, right? Kim Kardashian and Madonna, those are people who are, I think, self-confessed narcissists. A lot of us like them. And popular narcissists are fine as long as we like them, right? But we don't tend to think in those constructs. We tend to think someone that I don't like, who thinks too much of themselves, is a narcissist. And that's, I think, overly simplistic, and I don't think that's correct. And we're going to go into the psychology in more detail to say why that's not correct, or why it needs fine-tuning. So, like I said, there seems to be a reflexive thing nowadays. When you don't like someone, they're automatically a narcissist. Have you ever done that? It's an us or them thing. I don't like you. You are then flawed. You're a narcissist, therefore I'm not. It's always also somebody else is the narcissist. Do you ever think about, am I a narcissist? It's always somebody else. And isn't that a kind of narcissism? If you twisted my arm and asked me to label Brian, you said, look, I know you don't normally use labels, but please do use a label. I describe him as an introvert with low self-esteem, anxiety, and struggling with low status. And that's the plight of a lot of men these days, and increasingly white men these days, young white men. But Brian in particular is an introvert, is an artist. Artists are typically introverted. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are. They write things down, they draw things, they're thinkers. But he has low self-esteem. His baldness is going to make his low self-esteem even lower. His baldness is going to make his anxiety even worse. The pandemic's also going to make things worse. Gabby's social media is going to make his anxiety worse, and he's struggling low status even worse as well. Ironically, narcissism is a factor in all of that, but in the opposite way that most people think. Whereas you may think that Brian thought a lot of himself and thought of himself in a self-important way and loved himself. I think it's the opposite. As I said, there's a healthy narcissism, for example, basic health, hygiene standards, where we wash ourselves, where we take care of our appearance. But there's also unhealthy narcissism, where there's not enough narcissism, where the narcissism, the minimum narcissism to which you might call self-love, right, or self-regard, isn't really there, right? So you might have somebody who's a preening peacock, right? And then where there's too much narcissism, or you might have someone who doesn't pay enough attention to themselves, where there's too little narcissism. And if you again compare these two characters, and I know they're not characters, they're people, but if you think of them as characters and you compare them to the characters we saw in Depp versus Heard, do you think they are as narcissistic as Johnny Depp and Amber Heard? When you saw Johnny Depp with all of the preening peacock stuff going on, and compare that to Brian, who doesn't wear earrings, he doesn't really dress up at all, he doesn't wear shoes, is quite understated, right? But Gabby as well. Gabby's not wearing dresses or anything either. She's not wearing makeup either. Do you get what I'm saying? It's the difference between a preening peacock, where there's too much narcissism potentially, and someone who's not paying enough attention to themselves. And we know that Brian was sometimes smelly, and the van was untidy. And if you're going to have this van life adventure and put it on social media, you're going to need to be aware of what other people think. And you kind of get the feeling that he didn't. And that bothered Gabby, kind of thing. Incidentally, taking care of one's appearance is an overlap, I feel, in the psychological area of narcissism and the separate area of self-esteem. So although some people say self-esteem is completely different to narcissism, one of the ways you check for narcissistic traits is how much do you care about your appearance, right? And the same applies to self-esteem. If you don't care a lot about your appearance, or you stopped caring about it, or you just don't show much interest in your own appearance, like Vincent van Gogh, like certain people, you actually have a self-esteem problem. Your self-esteem is actually quite low, right? So although narcissism and self-esteem aren't the same, they are linked, sometimes weakly, sometimes strongly. And so let me ask you guys the question: do you think, with in terms of Brian, if you're talking about narcissism, do you think Brian's self-esteem links to narcissism, or do you think it's totally separate? Do you think Brian's self-esteem is linked strongly to narcissism, or weakly? What do you think the answer is to that? I just want to have a look at some of your comments. He was a two-faced minimalist. Donna says he was acting grandiose at the restaurant. I think there's a bit of confusion about the restaurant. I got the feeling that there were mixed messages, and later on you found out that Gabby seemed to be upset about the bill or being double billed, and Brian was just a very quiet accessory to all of that. That was my impression. The Brian kind of comes out of the Mary Piglets as the bad guy, but when you pay more and more attention to the Mary Piglets incident, it actually seems like Gabby was upset about something. Maybe because she was paying the bill, maybe because the bill was more expensive than she expected. But you kind of got the feeling there's a lot of interaction between Gabby and the folks there, not so much with Brian. Having said that, it's been quite a long time since I dealt with it. I just remember it not being quite as straightforward. MS says he wasn't a narcissist, just extremely insecure. I think he really was very insecure. I think that's definitely true. Okay, let me do that. So I'm now going to quote from psycom.net, and it's talking about the links between self-esteem and narcissism. Narcissists have high self-esteem, right? And if you accept that, if you accept this particular diagnosis, then that excludes Brian, because Brian definitely didn't have high self-esteem. You can kind of see it during the Moab incident where Brian stutters and is not very sure of himself. And only after a certain point does he start chuckling and he finds his mojo. So this particular diagnosis of it says narcissists have high self-esteem, but they lack secure self-esteem, right? In other words, they have fragile high self-esteem. And I think this applied in a way to Brian. And I think Brian did have high self-esteem when he was with Gabby and when they were in love. But as soon as that was threatened, then he had fragile high self-esteem. And then if you took Gabby out of that equation, then he had no self-esteem. Then he had low self-esteem. And this form of self-esteem is extremely dependent on external validation and self-deception, or having fantasies of success, power, and beauty. And I don't see Brian having fantasies of beauty. I don't see Brian having fantasies of power or even success. Although I do think that he did have fantasies of having this beautiful girl part of his future. And I think that was ultimately a self-deception. And when he realized it was a self-deception, he insisted on it. When he realized that he'd actually deceived himself, that Gabby, things were actually never going to work between the two of them, he was exposed as deceiving himself and having a fantasy about someone who had more power, beauty, and success than what he did. I also think that he was extremely dependent in a way, in an ego sense, on Gabby. But I don't think he had high self-esteem. I don't have a sense that Brian had fragile high self-esteem, but fragile low self-esteem. Do you agree with that? I don't think Brian had fragile high self-esteem, but fragile low self-esteem. And I think that is borne out. I think that is proved by the confession and the fact that he can't tell the truth, and the fact that he does what he did, the fact that he wants his body torn apart by animals. Still trying to learn some of the tricks here. Do you guys agree with that? Pauline says Lullaby was in the horror section of the bookstore. Okay, so thanks for that, Nisi. Stephanie says yes, low self-esteem. Mercy K says he seemed mixed up and confused, immature. Mel Stiller says it comes down to one thing: two young people who wanted to be happy together but didn't know how. That's absolutely true. Also, that there was a kind of naivety in terms of this van life thing. They'd prepared for it, but they were very naive in terms of the reality of social media, the reality of the expenses, although to some extent they thought they'd prepared in that respect. And in terms of one another, the reality in terms of one vis-a-vis the other. The other thing is, to me, Brian wasn't interested in external validation as much as simply wanting to be in a validating relationship. Brian didn't really seem to care much about social media. He just doesn't participate as much in social media, and a lot of his social media is drawings and stuff. He wants to sell his art. That's the part that he's interested in, but he doesn't have a photo of himself with his art every time. In other words, he wants to be validated by Gabby, but beyond that, not really. And I think that's also quite a common psychology with young people. It's not like something strange. Now I'm going to take you to Psych Central, the difference between narcissism and high self-esteem. And this is from psychcentral.com. High self-esteem is a positive, life-enhancing quality. That's self-esteem. High self-esteem is a positive, life-enhancing quality. Now think about that with regard to someone who's training for the Olympics and they think they can get a gold medal and they think they're good enough and they've got this dream of an Olympic, magic carpet ride to the podium and it's all going to end happily ever after. It's a positive, life-enhancing quality, while narcissism is an unhealthy trait that ultimately leads to unhappiness. And I would say that the distinction is between the Olympian who dreams of the gold medal and has high self-esteem and it's positive and life-enhancing is the guy who has a realistic chance of getting the gold medal. So in other words, when your self-esteem is authentic, when your self-esteem is realistic, when it's true, then it's positive. But when it is delusional, inauthentic, unrealistic, then it's narcissism. And I definitely think Brian, there's a point in the relationship, bear in mind they were engaged. It's not like Brian was in this relationship and he was forcing Gabby to go along. Gabby actually got engaged with him as well. Gabby chose Brian to go with her on the van life trip. But they were both still evolving as people. And I think whichever parents said they're both too young to get married now, I think they were absolutely right. Because Gabby was still evolving as a person. She was increasing in her beauty, in her power, in her self, in a sense of self. And Brian was also changing in other ways, but he probably needed to realize she's out of my league and I need to earn a living. And this is never going to work, not only my relationship with Gabby, but the whole social media element to it. Or if we're going to make it work, I'm going to need to put my insecurities on the back burner or aside and be mature, but I don't think he could. And I'm not saying it's easy to do either. I don't know how easy it is. I know of a channel, Amanda Cerny's channel. I don't know if you guys know about it on Instagram. Amanda Cerny is the focus of it. Her boyfriend you sort of see every now and then. Some people can do that and pull it off and it works, but some people can't. It's not the easiest thing to have somebody as a kind of an object that everybody salivates over. I suppose you've got to have a sense of humor, but you've also got to have a strong sense of self and a strong identity. And I don't think Gabby or Brian really had that at that point. Narcissism is an unhealthy trait that leads to unhappiness. Intervention efforts should help those with narcissistic traits develop true self-esteem. So that was what Brian was missing, true self-esteem. I don't know whether Gabby had true self-esteem either, but I think she was a bit closer to it. I mean, if you think about it, Gabby going onto social media and doing the van life thing was something that could have worked. Brian doing that, I don't see that. I don't see that happening. Another thing to consider is Brian wasn't doing any flexing on social media. He didn't have a constant need for self-validation. At least not while his relationship with Gabby was on track. When it wasn't, he did probably yearn for things to be set right. Right? When the relationship wasn't on track, he probably did yearn for it to be set right. So a lot of the time, this is from the BBC. And it's an article, Why Some Narcissists Hate Themselves. It says here, this is from the BBC article dated April 2021. Quote, much of the time, a narcissist's behavior isn't driven by self-love, rather self-hatred. New findings reinforce this idea, noting that narcissistic behavior like flexing on social media might come from low self-esteem and a constant need for self-validation. I don't really get that sense from Brian. I don't really get the sense that he needed to flex on social media, as so many people do. But that doesn't mean he didn't have low self-esteem. I think he did have low self-esteem, but not narcissism. They're talking about narcissism related to low self-esteem and social media. Well, the social media aspect's missing from Brian, which means the narcissism aspect is also. Does that make sense? To repeat, Brian's not flexing on social media. Gabby was flexing more than what Brian was. A lot of these images that you see here are actually from Gabby's social media, not Brian's. As far as I know, this came from Brian's social media. Gabby's social media, this image. This image as well, I also think came from Gabby's social media. A lot of Brian's social media was pictures of not terribly good artwork, if you guys remember. And also pictures of Brian, like in the distance, where you couldn't really even see him that well. So let's come back to what you're talking about. We know that Brian and Gabby struggled with anxiety. And well, this is correlated not with high self-esteem, but low self-esteem. Struggling with anxiety is an issue of low self-esteem. I think in a way, Gabby chose Brian to marry because she struggled with self-esteem as well, though not as much as he did. Narcissism is more associated with externalizing behavior, but there's not much sign of this. There's no alcohol abuse, apparently minimal substance abuse, and only low levels of antisocial behavior. Now think about those traits again with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Those things, externalizing behavior and including substance abuse, is associated with narcissists. It's not present with Gabby and Brian, right? Can you hear somebody snoring? On the other hand, what is associated with narcissism is aggression, and we did see that from both sides, from both Gabby's side and Brian's side. So can you see with narcissism, there is narcissism with Brian and Gabby, but it's muddy, it's murky, it's not black and white. And so just to really impress on you the point, is narcissism and self-esteem the same thing, right? I think there are differences of opinion on this, and I'm going to just provide an opinion from a blog from the Scientific American on this question. And they say, whereas self-esteem was strongly related to lower levels of anxiety, right? So I think what that really means is where there's high self-esteem, it's correlated to lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression, lower global distress. Narcissism was only weakly related to these outcomes. Narcissism was much more associated with externalizing behavior, including alcohol or other substance abuse, antisocial behavior, and aggression. So if you say narcissism is associated with, for example, alcohol abuse, not present with Brian or Gabby. Substance abuse, not present with them either. You actually don't get the idea that they were using any substances excessively at all. You never hear that one or the other was drunk or delinquent or high or something like that, or almost never. So if we accept that Brian did have a problem with narcissism, and in my view, it's an unhealthy narcissism in that there is too little narcissism, too little wanting to be admired, too little wanting to be seen, too little wanting to make something of himself as a man and as a person, too little basically just wanting to make something of himself. When you look at this image of Brian, and I mean, remember, he's just 23 years old. What is he supposed to want to make of himself? But contrast that image with this one. That looks like a man who wants to go somewhere. That looks like a man who does want to make something of himself. But look at that Brian, who seems like an adult, and this Brian, which is a more recent picture, who looks like a kid. So put otherwise, if Brian had a fragile self-esteem, what was the cause of it? What is the root cause of it? I'm going to say that again. If Brian had a fragile self-esteem, what is the root cause of it? What do you guys think? In the mandate says, can you be equally yoked in your 20s? I think it's easy to be equally yoked if you both don't have jobs, if you both have similar sort of goals, like I want to graduate at university or college or whatever. If it's let's go on this van life journey. I'm a nature freak or whatever, and you read the same books. So I think when your world is quite small, it's quite easy to be equally yoked. I think it's when you grow as a person, then you've got to find someone who's growing at the same pace as you and has grown as much as you, perhaps in different ways, but is nevertheless someone who's, because you often have in relationships people who outgrow one another. You often hear about that. You know what I'm talking about? So on this question, what is the root cause of Brian's fragile self-esteem? Now, I don't know if you've noticed, I'm trying to take the conversation away from narcissism and towards something that we can kind of get a hold of, and that's self-esteem. Narcissism is like this broad amorphous concept that we all think we know what it means, but none of us really know what we're saying. It's just like, oh, he's narcissistic. When you talk about self-esteem, it's far more precise, and you can kind of get a handle on it. So if you say, what is the problem that Brian lacked self-esteem? Where did it come from? It may have come, like Chris Watts, from an overprotective mother. Brian was the youngest child, like Chris Watts, and probably didn't have the opportunity to properly individuate. In other words, he didn't have enough time. His sister got married quite early, and now it's like, well, Brian, now you need to get married as well, right? With Chris Watts, he had a much older sister, and so he didn't also have time to just be allowed to be Chris Watts and do his thing, right? I think Chris Watts also got married quite young, one could say. But the problem with Brian was that he didn't have the opportunity to properly individuate. Part of that is dealing with the fact that he's lost his hair, dealing with things like social media. So in other words, before you get engaged, have these experiences and without the pressure, and then decide what you're going to do with it. Decide, are you strong enough to overcome it, or are you going to fall apart? And so you need to pick yourself up and have a relationship with someone else who's going to put less pressure on you. So as I say, like Chris Watts, Brian didn't stand on his own, didn't have enough opportunity to stand on his own. and both of them were ensconced in the family cocoon. He doesn't have a chance to stand apart, to go out and have an adventure of his own and come back with some kind of, what do you call it, skill or treasure or something. He hasn't gone on the hero's journey. He hasn't become a hero. That's his problem, right? He's ensconced in the family cocoon, and when he tried to emerge from it, like that's when everything happened. He realized he didn't have any skills. He didn't have any treasure to offer. Also, it doesn't really count being a hero in the family cocoon. It does count that your family loves you and values you and thinks of you in some ways as a hero, but you need to also go and prove it in the outside world. You need to stand on your own. You need to develop your own identity. You need to overcome your own anxiety without support sometimes, right? And so that is something that is up to all of us. All of us have got to leave the nest and become heroes in our own story, and then meet other heroes or other heroines, and then it's authentic. If you think about it, in the middle of his great adventure towards independence, he flew home for 6 days from August 17 to 23. So in the middle of Brian's great grand adventure that was being sort of bragged about on social media, he goes home to help unpack a storage lock or something. He goes home. It's not a very inspiring story. Like, this is us free and living in the outdoors, and we love one another, and it's so amazing. Well, in the middle of that, he goes home. So that brings us to another question then. You say, what is the root cause of Brian's self-esteem? And you say, well, maybe he was overprotected. Maybe he was in the family cocoon for too long. And what was the first thing he did after the catastrophe at the Spread Creek camp? Well, he erased home, right? The first thing he did after that disaster was he went straight home, and then he went to the reserve after that. So you think about the root cause of self-esteem problems. One of them is something like overprotective or a domineering parent that doesn't allow you to find yourself. They're always telling you what to do, or a controlling parent or a perfectionistic parent. Now let's ask the question, what's the root cause of narcissism? And the interesting thing is, certainly according to this source, is they say they don't actually know. They're not quite sure what the root cause is of narcissism. And I don't really like the way the question's asked. It's not what's the root cause of narcissism, because we're all narcissistic. We live in a very narcissistic society. It should be, what is the root cause of unhealthy narcissism? And unhealthy narcissism is either you are too narcissistic, you think too much of yourself and it's unrealistic and it's toxic, or you don't think enough of yourself and that makes you aggressive and unpleasant and antisocial, whichever one it is. But I think whenever you refer to narcissism, it should be preceded with the word unhealthy, because there is such a thing as healthy narcissism. And I don't think our society understands that. Narcissism is important. It's important that it's authentic, right? So what's the answer to the question? What is the root cause of unhealthy narcissism? And they say here that they're not sure, but they think that it may have something to do with vulnerable children, right? They say it could have to do with children who are brought up in overprotective households, or where they are neglected. So it's either the one or the other. Either the children are not loved enough and they're neglected, which means they grow up to not love themselves enough, or not love themselves in a healthy way, or not have the right regard for themselves in society, the right kind of regard compared to everyone else, or they brought up in an overprotective household where there's so much excess and there's so much attention that they think they're far more important than they really are relative to everybody else. right? So can you see that the one is overprotective, the other one is neglect? The one is too much attention, and the other one is too little. And I think quite an interesting way to think about this in a totally different scenario is, for example, the John Benet Ramsey case. Was John Benet's, the parenting styles in terms of John Benet, was it overprotective or neglectful? If you think about Kaylee Anthony, was the parenting style overprotective or neglectful? Was the parenting style with Chris Watts overprotective or neglectful? Was the parenting style with the Chris Watts family, with their own kids, was it overprotective or neglectful? And that can have an impact either way. Then I also say genetics and neurobiology may also play a role in narcissism. So it can also just be genetic. So just to come to a kind of a more general point, I don't want to be so big. Let me put something else on here. Those who insist on using the term narcissism, even when it doesn't really match, as we saw in the Chris Watts case, and I wrote quite a few books on the Chris Watts case, and I pushed against the narcissism narrative all along. There were experts, I think Dr. Phil was one of them, but there were other experts who said it was narcissism. I've kind of kicked against that all along, and I do the same with this case. So those who insist on using the term narcissism, we saw in the Chris Watts case, they would then pivot to a qualifying version of narcissism. This is what I just find ridiculous, just in my own opinion. So you say Chris Watts is a narcissist, and maybe you say Brian Laundrie is a narcissist. Then you say, yes, but he doesn't quite fit the profile. Then you say, oh, I understand. Well, no, he's actually a covert narcissist, which is why I put it as the second option in the poll. But listen to what we're talking about. So I guess a covert narcissist is either secretly on social media, because that's what covert means, right? You're like secretly a narcissist, or he secretly wants to be. Do you think Brian Laundrie secretly wanted to be on social media? Or he secretly wanted to wear a suit, or he secretly wanted a mohawk or something? If you don't understand introverts, you don't really understand that they just don't want to be, that they are not like you. If you're an extrovert, or if you on social media all the time. So this idea that they secretly want to be obsessively on social media, maybe it makes sense to you, but it actually just doesn't really translate to who these people really are. They're not interested. Whereas introversion does. Introversion does translate to these people. Introversion does translate to the artist and the person writing things down. I mean, Brian didn't post his confession on social media. He wrote it down on a crappy little notebook that could easily have gotten washed away. That's not someone who thinks a terrible amount of his final message to the world. It's someone who, if anything, doesn't think enough about it. And often there is a dark side to introverts. It's kind of a cliche in a way, especially when all that internalized brooding, daydreaming, and analysis doesn't play out nearly so well in the real world. We all know this with introverts, is that they spend a lot of time playing back thoughts and ideas and schemes and concepts and plans or whatever it is, ideas and actions. And Brian probably thought a lot about Gabby and their life together, but it ended up being internalized brooding, daydreaming, something that was ultimately unrealistic. And that then brings us to another source talking about covert narcissism. So if you say, I think Brian's a covert narcissist, well, that correlates strongly with introversion. And introversion often correlates to a certain level of self-esteem. There are a lot of introverts who've got very strong self-esteem, So it's not necessarily that introverts are shy or that they've got self-image problems, but also a lot of introverts do. A lot of introverts are shy. A lot of introverts are, they may not be incredibly attractive. And so, but they're also introverts. And so that makes them more introverted. So one expert says covert narcissism correlates strongly with introversion. He says, if you have one, you more than likely have the other, although there are plenty of introverts who don't have narcissistic tendencies. Covert narcissism is a sort of dark side of introversion, right? So again, we've gone from narcissism to talking about self-esteem to talking about introversion. And I think you'll agree with me that by not knowing absolutely for a fact that Brian is a narcissist, in other words, saying maybe it's not quite that, maybe it's something else, we're actually getting to know him a little bit better. In other words, by figuring out what he is and what he isn't, and by taking different stabs from different psychological perspectives, you actually kind of get a better understanding of his psychology than you did through the one-dimensional vagueness of he's a narcissist. Do you agree with that, or do you think no, I had a pretty good handle on it anyway? So to come back to what Nicole Schmidt said, I do think she's onto something when she refers in her tweet to a classic narcissism trait, which is gaslighting, where she says narcissists rewrite history to escape accountability. She's onto something there. Gaslighting is used to make someone question their reality, and Brian Laundrie's 8-page confession does precisely that. I think Brian was also gaslighting during the Moab incident. Chris Watts' multiple confessions, but especially the first one, did that too. I'm almost done. In the midst of Brian's suicide, which is an unhealthy narcissism taking over, so think about suicide where you say, my life's not worth living, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody, I'm worthless, I'm not good to anyone, I don't belong here, nobody loves me. All of that is unhealthy narcissism. It's not, I'm not grandiose. I'm not thinking that I'm awesome. I'm thinking that I'm no thing, right? Without Gabby, I'm no thing. I'm nothing. In the midst of Brian's suicide, which is an unhealthy narcissism taking over, a healthy narcissism nevertheless surfaces, a healthy aspect in terms of that surfaces, or it pretends to. Brian presents himself as the hero of his story, which we've talked about, and wanting to be a hero is, of course, narcissism. So Brian being the hero of his story, where he tries to save Gabby and he does what she asks or whatever, that's a kind of narcissism. So he's acknowledging that it exists, and he's trying to reconcile himself with that, right? But the problem is his story isn't true. The problem is his story is inauthentic. And this is where you can see that he has a very unhealthy narcissism, not on the scale of grandiose, but the opposite side. It is narcissistic, but it's unhealthy, but he doesn't think enough of himself. And one of the ways that you can see that it is what it is it's so unrealistic. Brian's story is so unrealistic. What does that tell you? Brian is unrealistic. Brian was unrealistic in terms of his relationship with Gabby, and it was becoming a more and more unrealistic relationship over time. Unfortunately, I've left my mug of water downstairs. But that's the point I want to make. And a lot of young people are unrealistic. They were unrealistic about money, Brian and Gabby. They were unrealistic about each other. They'd been arguing a lot anyway. They were unrealistic about the social media. Putting up one YouTube video after 2 months basically on the road, that's nowhere near enough. Even their Instagrams were quite few and far between. I mean, there were no Instagrams really of the Bonneville salt flats, or of, well, I think there's a little bit in the YouTube, and also I'm just trying to think. Nothing of the Grand. I mean, they were in the Grand Tetons. I think they got there on the 25th, wasn't it? So no social media. There should have been social media kind of the moment they got there, but maybe they were still curating it. So to summarize, Brian's story was inauthentic. His confession was inauthentic. Why? Because his narcissism is inauthentic. He's trying to seem like he thinks a lot of himself. He's trying to seem as though he has game. He's trying to seem as though he's got some personality in a way. But the thing is, it's not covert. It's not real. It's not a question that it's covert. It's not real. And so he's got to manufacture it. So criminals habitually make use of gaslighting. They did this before the term gaslighting became a thing in the modern lexicon. Narcissists make use of gaslighting a lot, but that doesn't mean they're criminals. In the same way, criminals make use of gaslighting a lot because their whole deal is to get investigators to question their perception of reality, the evidence. Just think of this in a general sense. Criminals are gaslighting all the time because they want you to question your reality. But that doesn't mean they're narcissists. It means they're trying to get away with whatever they've done. They're trying to give you a different sense of reality. So all of that is just another version of the TCRS-ism, which is all murderers are liars, but not all liars are murderers. Let me say that again. So it's a TCRS, it's a true crime rocket science-ism that I've used in a lot of the books that I've written. All murderers are liars, but not all liars are murderers. So if all narcissists are liars, stay with me on this. If all narcissists are liars, not all liars are murderers. Ergo, not all murderers are narcissists. Put otherwise, all murderers aren't narcissists, even if all narcissists are liars. I'm sure I've totally confused you guys with that one. So in my view, this is summing up. Brian isn't a narcissist. He lacks healthy narcissism. In other words, he needs to be more narcissistic, or he needed to be more narcissistic than he was. And that's not what I think a lot of you guys believe. I think you believe he was too narcissistic. I think his problem was low self-esteem, also attaching himself to someone until death us do part, and an obsessive voyeurism in materials that repeatedly conjured scenarios about doing just that. And I've quoted from Fight Club, this quote, that's one of the books that Brian read. A quote from Fight Club reads, "Only after disaster can we be resurrected. It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. Nothing is static." And bear in mind, the avatar for the YouTube channel was nomadic static. Well, didn't that static come from this particular quote? Nothing is static. Everything is evolving. Everything is falling apart. Well, that particular quote says a lot about Gabby and Brian, and also I think Brian's attitude to what was happening. Almost like, it's okay if it falls apart. Only after disaster can I be resurrected. And so is it the end of the world if there is disaster? And so he does try to resurrect himself in his writing, in his letter. And I think a lot of that comes from the fantasy and the sort of things he was reading, where he thought, I can do this and I can conjure reality, and it's all part of the sort of Fight Club nuance or the lullaby fabric. And it's to that extent that he was really not very real about real life. And that, I think, was Brian's problem. Timmy, can I put you down? So that's my spiel. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to show you some screen grabs I took of the trial. Did anyone notice that person there? Anyone know who this is? Did anyone talk about that sort of on social media or sort of bring it up? Here's another picture. She's sitting over there. There she is again. Anyone know who that is? Yeah, it's Rose. It's Rose. So it's actually quite interesting to see Rose attending the trial or attending the hearing, and one wonders whether we're going to hear from her again. Rose Davies, right? That's Gabby's best friend. And you know, if anyone's going to give us an idea, a better idea of Gabby and Brian, it's Rose. She gave one interview and then we never really heard from her again, and one wonders whether we will hear from her again. So we'll see. But did anyone notice that? Did anyone mention it elsewhere on social media, people covering this? I'm just wondering, I'm just curious. And bear in mind, there was this chance that Rose was going to join Gabby. I think she was turning 21, and she was possibly going to join Gabby on the next leg of their journey. And what did Brian think about that? How did Brian think about that when he found out? Thought Criminal says, not that I've seen. Okay, so let's have another look at the poll. 53% say that you think Brian was a narcissist. If you add that to, yes, a covert narcissist, that's 83%. That's a huge majority of you guys. So interesting to see that. I hope that's going to change. I hope that people think about that term cautiously in the future. I don't think it's a very helpful term. It's used I've been in true crime for quite a long time, and the previously popular term was psychopath or sociopath. So someone, if you didn't like someone or if they committed a crime, they're immediately a psychopath. And that's just not accurate either. A lot of crimes are committed because somebody gets very emotional, and I think Brian was one of them. So it's just like one of those empty terms that comes into use, and I don't think it's very helpful. I personally don't like using labels a lot, but social media is very binary and people like to simplify things. But I do hope that those of you who did vote no understand why there's this other psychology to it, that there's a lot of intelligent discussion on other issues like self-esteem and things like introversion. I personally have a problem calling someone a narcissist when we live in a narcissistic society. I don't know if our society has ever been so spoiled. There's been so much excess. There's been so much stuff. The whole consumer society is geared to a narcissistic mindset. You can choose the color of your toothbrush. You can have everything the way you want it exactly. You have your social media curated the way you want it as well. And I don't know how you can call other people narcissists when everyone in a narcissistic society is narcissistic. That's why I say the question is it healthy? How healthy is it? Is it unhealthy? How unhealthy is it? That's just my take on it. So I hope you guys have found this an interesting analysis. I hope you've enjoyed the format. If you're watching this on replay, please don't be shy to, if you've enjoyed this, if you agree with it, if you've learned something from it, hit the thanks button. Yeah, if you're not a subscriber and you found this of merit and you feel it's something that has been needed to be said, or whatever it is, make sure you subscribe. Would be good to have more like-minded folk on this channel. Terry Dean says, thank you, Nick, Timmy, Mods, and chat. Another insightful live. Uppercut says, thank you, Stephanie, Sharon, and Nick. So I just want to thank the mods. Sharon, Stephanie says, I'm not ready to throw out the narcissist baby with the bathwater. Feeding Gabby's insecurities to gain control feels very covert to me. Okay. Are there any super chats I need to? Okay, thanks a lot, Terry. Gabby definitely had insecurities, but I think Brian did as well. I feel like self-esteem is the real problem with both of them. That they both needed probably to develop their sense of selves, and also with that to develop their social media, and also to develop a social media strategy. How am I going to feel if, and I think that's what people need to do in general. In family situations, if you start a relationship with someone new, I think a conversation you've got to have is, what is our social media strategy going to be? When are we going to come out about being in a relationship? If we stop being in a relationship, what are we going to do? What have you done in the past? How much are we going to share? How do you feel about privacy, whatever? I think those are all conversations that need to be had. And I don't think they're done in a formal enough manner. I think it needs to be kind of, kind of a default thing that couples talk about. Wow, 2 hours. This felt to me like an hour. I don't know how long it felt to you guys. Okay. Are there any more questions or comments? Thought Criminal says, and everyone feels the need for a box to put their psychology into. Terry says, why wouldn't he just help her with her endeavors online instead of shooting her down? Poor Gabby. Because I think he saw that as a threat to himself. So you must remember, it's not happening inside of a vacuum. It's a situation of Brian is already on the back foot. They're arguing, and you must remember, if it's not you, it can still be a big deal, right? If you are on the losing end of social media, then every single post is humiliating. Every single post is undermining. Every single post is confirming that somebody else is more beautiful. But not only that, it's also, aren't there guys on social media that are flirting with her? I mean, aren't there young guys that are looking at Brian and Gabby's social media and saying how beautiful she is? And he's seeing that, and how does he feel about that? Well, isn't he going to want to take control of that, right? And then when he puts up social media, obviously he gets invalidated every time he does that, right? So it's a good question, Terry, but you've got to put yourself in his shoes and see him seeing it as a threat. It's not only a threat that he's experiencing, but he's wondering, what is Gabby thinking about it? And Gabby might be thinking, wow, Brian's actually quite weak. Brian's actually quite fragile. Wow, people don't really like Brian. Wow, this, that, and the next thing, right? And as Brian becomes more triggered and more vulnerable and more reactionary, Gabby's got to become the sort of the mature adult in the thing, and that only invalidates the whole relationship even more. Does that make sense? Tina Vogel says, I'm so glad I made it to a live. Great discussion and insight as always. Georgia Girl says, yes, I feel the same, cathartic. Thought Criminal says, that being said, narcissism covers too many boxes, all in one broad box. Jane Burdick says, I think Brian tried to tear down to make himself feel better. I think the problem was that Brian was insecure, passive-aggressive, and had a very low self-esteem. And a lot today is based on appearances. And Gabby's appearance was improving, his wasn't. And then you translate all of that to social media, right? Did Zista says, or did Zastra, the format is really nice and your content very thought-provoking and insightful. Got me thinking again. That's the idea. So if you did that, that's cool. Jane Burdick says she tried to have a more positive outlook. So I want to leave you guys with a thought, and that is, think about your narcissism. And I don't want you to think about it as good or bad. I want you to think about it as healthy or unhealthy, right? I want you to think about, are there areas where your narcissism is good, right? In terms of how you take care of your family and your social circle and your fitness and your health, right? And is there an area where your narcissism is unhealthy? And I just want you to think about that, going out of this episode into the next half an hour or an hour. And if you think about it once or twice tomorrow, just think about those ideas. I'm sure it's quite unfamiliar to many of you. Think about, is this narcissism, and is it healthy or is it unhealthy? And again, compared to others, think about what is the standard, and is the standard healthy as well? And then the last thing I want to bring up is from this magazine article. It's from the New Scientist, and it talks about the pursuit of happiness. And what's really interesting is they highlight the population of Finland as being the happiest in the world. And the Finns consider themselves, and this is from a, I'm just trying to see where it is. It's, I think, from a psychologist who says the Finns consider themselves introverts and melancholy. So if you're trying to pursue happiness, is extroversion the answer? If you're trying to pursue happiness, is social media the answer? I'm talking about social media where it's all about I'm so happy, right? Can social media also say this actually went wrong? Can social media also say, be human and say either I made a mistake or, this happened and it really wasn't great or whatever? Can social media be authentic? And if it is, can that lead to a more authentic kind of happiness for everybody, right? Because if everyone's lying about being happy, then it's almost like everyone becomes miserable. I'm just saying Finland is a country that's regarded as the happiest country in the world. And it's the people, the Finns themselves are introverted and they think of themselves as melancholy, right? So in other words, if you are more authentic about your happiness on social media, it doesn't have to be quite so extroverted. It doesn't have to be quite so happy. Then maybe it can actually be more realistic. And maybe that's the way to happiness, right? Just something to think about. I hope that's a nice note to end on. Thanks a lot to you guys for listening. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Just need to go to, I normally hit my phone, but now it's goodbye on the screen. All the best. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.